When it comes to crypto, I think one of the main challenges is user interface and the user experience of crypto. And I think that we're getting to a place now where
I want you to introduce yourself and what are you working on?
I'm Howard. I'm the founder of Alio. And I think what Alio brings to the crypto market is something complementary to an Ethereum. And the reason for that is,
Why do you think that addressing privacy is going to be something that brings mass adoption into the crypto space?
everyone's been talking about stablecoins. No one's been talking about private stablecoins. And I really think that we're missing the mark as an ecosystem at large in crypto. So I think a big part of this actually has to do with
Excellent. Well, we're here in Singapore. I like to start off all my guests with a bit of a hot take or a difficult question. I want to ask you, what do you think is the number one thing holding back crypto today?
I think that's a great question. So when it comes to crypto, I think one of the main challenges right now is honestly the user interface and the user experience of crypto. For the most part, most people like my parents don't use crypto because it's such a technical and such a difficult space to understand. And I think that we're getting to a place now where crypto is getting a lot better at addressing, the average person's needs. From a user experience, they're no longer having to reason about private keys. You can now have, for example, iCloud integrations for your keychain and passkeys. But I think there's a whole user experience side of it that still needs a lot of work.
More kind of product focused. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just talking to my girlfriend this morning and like I had to send her $100 or something. And I was like, man, this would be easier if you just had crypto, And she was like, no, I can't figure out all that stuff. And it's like, if my girlfriend can't figure out crypto, we have a long way to go still.
Yeah. Well, I'll just add like, as much as crypto has a difficult technical hurdle to overcome, I also, when I send wire transfers from my bank, like it's crazy. Like last week I was actually trying to send a transfer, and I learned that my bank actually requires me to fill out a PDF form if it's an international wire, and then upload it to a secure message center where a person then physically called me to confirm the details, and then they had to like do a quick check before I could send it out. And I was like, this took 3 business days to do.
Right. Yeah, no, I think a lot about like crypto is so rules based, and that's part of the reason why people I think are scared to use it because you can accidentally send it to the wrong address or something. But at the same time, it means like if I send, a stablecoin transfer, I know it's going to get there.
Right.
And I know that if I, plug in the right address, use my wallet, transfer to this wallet, it'll just work. Anyways, I caught you off guard.
No, it's
I
great.
want you to introduce yourself and what are you working on?
Sure. I'm Howard. I'm the founder of Alio, and I basically have been building out this protocol to introduce private smart contracts into layer 1 blockchains for the last few years. We launched last year in September with Coinbase. We've been live for the past year, and today I now run the labs company building products and services on top of the network.
And what's your background?
So I got into crypto actually about, I'd say, a little over a decade ago. Candidly, I was in high school, didn't know what I was doing, but I was very into computers. And so because of that, I heard about Bitcoin, heard about this magical internet money, got really fascinated by it, and ended up pursuing research during my time in college around this space. So early on, looking at consensus protocols and just different types of algorithms on that front. Then eventually really honed in on an area of cryptography called zero knowledge proofs, which led us to develop a research paper that actually started Alio.
So tell me a bit about Alio's unique approach to the space and exactly kind of what you guys are building, what world you guys are building for.
So I think the simplest way to describe it is imagine if you had Ethereum, but with private state. So like a private Ethereum where, you have a blockchain, it's decentralized, it's open, it's permissionless. But the smart contracts can hold not just public information, but also private information. So for instance, if you wanted to send a transfer that's fully end-to-end encrypted, you can do that on Alio. If you wanted to have a DEX that offered dark pools, so private swaps, that's possible on Alio. And more so if you wanted to be a part of GameFi and you want to play games like Battleship where there's information asymmetry, that's something that is uniquely possible on Alio.
So what specifically about Alio do you think is kind of the new value proposition you guys are bringing to the world?
Well, I think one of the most exciting areas right now, everyone's been talking about stablecoins. No one's been talking about private stablecoins. And I really think that we're missing the mark as an ecosystem at large in crypto on how payments are supposed to work. Okay. In the real world, when you look at the opportunity for for payments on a day to day, you really have a lot of underlying assumptions about how payment works. What I mean by that is, if you're a business and you want to accept stable coins, you want to make sure that you're not going to leak your business revenue to everyone who pays you, right? But the problem right now with our existing designs is I can just go to a block explorer, look up your address, and see how much money you made this week, how frequently your customers come back every month, and more so your revenue this quarter over last quarter. Those are things that really reveal kind of that the user journey of money right now is really quite broken in crypto. And I think one of the main opportunities for Alio right now is to reshape that narrative.
Have you talked to any of the like kind of trad tech or Web2 stakeholders around this experience and how off-putting it is to them?
Absolutely. In fact, I've spoken to dozens of financial institutions this year alone. And one of the most frequent comments that I've heard from them is that these Web2 teams are uncomfortable embracing Web3 rails because of the fact that they don't have banking level privacy for their transaction data. And this is an issue for the customer as well as for them as a business.
Right. Another thing you mentioned is kind of the ability for dark pools. We heard a bit about this in kind of 2020, 2021. A couple of teams were working on it. There's been a thread through to today, but now recently, especially around perp dexes, we've heard a bit more about dark pools. How does Alio address this problem, and why is this important?
Well, so, I think the idea of dark pools has been around for many years, but the tech has only gotten practical in the last, call it 2 years or so. ZK historically has always been incredibly slow on computers, and it's not until modern processors have come around that now you can actually run these things in just a few seconds. So I think because of that, you're starting to see a lot more teams besides just us exploring this particular area. And I think for a lot of crypto traders, they like this area and they value this space because what brought them into crypto was the fact that it was this open, permissionless, inherently decentralized narrative and ecosystem that they could trade in. And now this is an opportunity to take that to the next level.
In some cases, I think the openness is attractive to a certain type of user, and definitely culturally, we see things in crypto around being openness, right? People wallet tracking, people wallet tracking is one example of this, or being able to understand what institutions. MEV is another example of this. Do you think that, or why do you think that privacy in a big way hasn't caught on, and why do you think that addressing privacy in a big way is going to be something that brings kind of mass adoption into the crypto space?
So I think a big part of this actually has to do with market education. If you go back 10 years ago and you ask the average crypto user, is Bitcoin private? People would have said yes at the time. Now I think most people recognize that Bitcoin is only pseudo-anonymous. But back then, the market was not wise enough to really understand what they were dealing with. They saw a bunch of hexadecimal addresses and they saw a bunch of gibberish and transaction IDs that were all, it looked like kind of ciphertext encodings, right? So they thought this was a private product, but in fact it wasn't. And the track and trace of it turned out to be very easy. And we saw that being used by all sorts of data scientists as well as even authorities. And so, I think that's kind of one side of it. I think the other side of it is that now you're starting to see the same thing happen with traders. There's sites like Arkham, for example, where you can just go down the top whales, the top holders, and monitor them. And while I think for a lot of traders, they see that as a positive, I think for those with a lot of capital, for example, financial institutions trying to get into crypto, they see that as a huge negative. So, I think we've gotten very far with the tech that we have so far. And for the market size that we're at, I think it makes sense. But I think if we want to go even bigger to, real kind of traditional pockets of money and bring those folks into crypto, you need to introduce privacy for them because they would not be comfortable. Like JP Morgan's not going to sit there showing you exactly how they're rebalancing their positions, or Vanguard, God forbid, is rebalancing RWAs in real time and letting everyone scalp them as they're front running. And that's just not going to happen in the real world. And so I think to get crypto into that real world mainstream adoption, you actually need to introduce privacy as an additional layer now.
How do these institutions think about privacy? Is it around like something specific as trading? Is it around just wanting to obfuscate the flows of money? Are there components of open finance that they are interested in? Or do you think it will look more like the private kind of financial rails that exist right now?
So from my interactions and my experience, I think it's actually a little bit of both. So I think that when it comes to the business intelligence side of it, they're extremely sensitive to that. I was talking with one of the largest payment providers out there about how they think about stablecoin adoption, and they had said that they have a lot of customers who are actually competitors in the market using their rails, and they constantly are trying to figure out what the other businesses, what their competitors doing effectively. And so, even leaking simple things like timestamps or frequency data, not even saying who the sender, the recipient, or the amount were, just knowing the frequency alone allows them to gather projections and figure out, if they're doing better this quarter over last quarter. So that is one side that I'd say has been an inherent risk. And then I'd say the other side that has really come up is the compliance side of it, that they actually need some level of privacy, not just for themselves, but for their users and their customers. Because imagine if like you sign into your bank account, like your JP Morgan Chase account, and all of a sudden, like everyone can see what's going on in your financial histories, past, present, and future. Like that's a user journey that people don't expect, and they've taken for granted in the Web 2 model to just be there. But of course, in Web 3, that doesn't exist today. So these are some of the areas where I see that it's become a very common issue and a very persistent issue across a lot of different institutions.
In the multi-chain space, we've obviously seen massive adoption, across Ethereum, Solana. How do you guys fit in this multi-chain space? And do you think that you guys can disrupt or compete on the scale of a chain like Ethereum or Solana one day?
I think what Alio brings to the crypto market is something complementary to an Ethereum, a Solana, a Base, a Polygon, you name it. And the reason for that is Alio is an architecture that was built from the ground up to be private by default, where a lot of these smart contract platforms were designed to be public by default. So as you can imagine, once something is out in the open, it's really hard to take it back. Whereas when you start private, you can selectively disclose and choose what you want to make public information, right? So, I think for a lot of these chains, they certainly recognize that privacy is going to be an important narrative going forward as we get into real world adoption for real world use cases. But the challenge is that their architectures are inherently at odds with privacy. And so while they can get close to the idea of privacy, they won't be able to achieve full privacy, which is what a lot of these financial institutions are actually looking for. And I think that's where we really come in and say, look, we are an L1 just like any other L1. We are decentralized. We are out there and permissionless, and we can bridge to any of these chains. And I think that for the end user, they're in the future going to think about public pools of money and private pools of money. And I wouldn't be surprised if wallet designs down the road actually introduce like a shield tab where you have a tab for like your assets that are transparent and a tab for your assets that are private or shielded. And I think that is probably going to be the way that people start to reason about their assets and their holdings.
So do you think most capital in crypto will move towards private blockchain or have some level of privacy?
I think increasingly so. Like right now, if you just look at last year, $27 trillion of payments were settled on stablecoins, and 99% of all of those transactions were done out in the open.
Right.
And I think that if you look, 5 years down the road from today, call it around 2030, I think at least half of those will have migrated into a end-to-end encrypted payment form. And I think that a big part of it has to do with not just the transaction data itself, but also the security of the wallet long term. That there's increasingly, for example, kidnap and ransom happening in crypto, and people don't want to reveal how much they hold. But obviously, going to a block explorer, I can just start to index that, and if I have additional data that I tie in, I can immediately de-anonymize what wallet that is. And so people want to hold their assets securely in that regards, even just from a safety and security standpoint.
Why is it important to have privacy at the kind of base layer versus just, shielding something like Zcash or, there's multiple solutions higher up the stack?
No, this is a really good topic. So when you look at the first gen privacy coins like a Zcash or a Monero, I think there were many shortcomings that we've now learned throughout that journey from the past decade. So first off, users want things more than just the base asset itself, because a Zk or an XMR, it's a highly volatile asset, and most businesses don't want to transact in a highly volatile asset. They would prefer a stable coin. So step one is issue private stable coins, and I don't think that those chains are in a position to support custom assets or ERC20 like assets anytime soon. If you look even further and you're talking about financial institutions, they need compliance mechanisms that are going to work in every jurisdiction that they do business in, whether it be in the US, whether it be in Singapore, whether it be in Japan or Dubai, you name it. Like every jurisdiction as you know, has their own regulatory bodies, and they will look at compliance from a different lens. So when you look at how Zcash and Monero were architected, these were one size fit all compliance mechanisms, meaning there was like a view key that lets you see everything or nothing. And there wasn't any configurable compliance built into those systems. And a big part of that was because there was no smart contracts in those layers. So the minute that you introduce private smart contracts, you now can actually introduce policy engines and rules engines that dictate what should be revealed at what time to who, and what parties should be authorized to transact, or who should be attesting and authorizing escrows, for example, at certain points in time. And so those are the types of things that suddenly open up once you introduce private smart contracts. And that's where I think Alio is uniquely positioned to actually enable that in the market.
So what you're saying is on Alio, at the kind of app layer, I can build out a privacy framework where, a user can see this, and the founding team has an access to this part, but maybe not this part, and there's, for compliance purposes, ability for a government or a tax authority to see in.
Correct. So just to illustrate it more concretely, when I say private smart contracts, I'm not actually saying that everything should be private. What I'm saying is that the developer, the builder, the user get to decide what should be public and what should be private. And so, for instance, in the programming language, Leo, we designed it so that there's this keyword where you can say, I want this data to be private. I want this data to be public. So you can choose how much privacy you want, or how much transparency you want. And the benefit of that is you enable journeys and use cases based on what you're actually trying to do. So for example, let's say I am a YouTuber who likes to stream my content. Maybe I want to allow people to do anonymous tips. So they can tip me. And in that case, you may want the sender to be private. You may want the recipient to be public and the amount to be public. So people can see, I as a streamer, how much money I'm making,
right,
but I'm not just de-anonymizing, showing everyone who are all of my donors. That's an example there. Or similarly, let's say you want to do like a blind auction where people are bidding on that. Well, in those cases, it's fine to show who the parties are, who the identities are, but you don't want to reveal the amounts because that kind of ruins the point of a blind auction. So this is the type of configurations that suddenly become possible when you add in programmability into it. And I really think that for a lot of the financial institutions, they're actually thinking about it from a slightly different lens. They're thinking about it from saying, I want to do a pilot that's in a closed loop where I can fully control the end-to-end to start. And in those cases, you actually need a chain that supports full privacy to do those pilots. And over time, they may say, well, actually we want to open access to this other bank or to this other company. And in which case, then you can start to make that closed loop a little bit more open, and you can selectively choose that information as time goes on. But it's very hard to do that on a public by default blockchain.
It's a bit more iterative and adaptable.
Yeah.
Interesting. Is there also kind of all the public functionality on Alio? So like NFTs, I imagine, or social or meme coins or something where the social public aspect is a feature and not a bug that still exists.
Those absolutely still fully exist. And so there are on-chain mappings. You can reference public data. You can do peer-to-peer via smart contracts as you would in an account-based model there. So that's where I think it's really, you get the best of both worlds in this case. And it's more about adapting for reality. It's, we weren't really philosophically saying, oh, it must be this way. No, it was really looking at the business practicals and saying, what are the use cases that actually would help to unlock new narratives in crypto? And we built an architecture based around those assumptions.
Right. What's the current ecosystem like on Alio? Is it mostly TradFi institutions building apps? Do you guys have the kind of typical DEX, DEX lending protocol kind of infrastructure that most chains have? How do you think about the ecosystem?
So a lot of the early ecosystem is focused around stablecoins, around payments, and a little bit around DeFi right now. So I'd say that most of the people coming into the space have been excited by the fact that they can now integrate use cases that did not work on other blockchains. So I'll give you one. Like, let's look at payroll. Request Finance was one that recently announced a partnership with Alio. And what they have found, historically, is that, if you want to pay your team in crypto, The problem, of course, is that if you get paid from a wallet, I can just look up that wallet address and see how much my colleagues make or how much my boss makes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's obviously a huge HR nightmare. So for a lot of CFOs, they value using a system where they can pay out in crypto, but ensure that the company preserves its data privacy for its
Right.
employees. And these are the types of journeys that just simply would not be possible on an Ethereum-like chain.
Mm-hmm. What's the dev experience like on Alio? How similar is it to other chains, or is it, is it at all similar to other chains?
Yeah, it's actually quite similar. So the programming language is called Leo. It syntactically reads and looks a lot like JavaScript or TypeScript. So I think
Mm-hmm.
for a lot of web devs, they understand what they're getting themselves into. The programming model changes a little bit because unlike in other smart contracts, you have off-chain execution and then you have on-chain settlement. So you have two buckets of logic that you can write now. It's basically for the off-chain parts, that's where you can be very expressive. You can write code that takes a minute, it takes an hour. Hell, it can take a day for you to execute that code. And the network's fine with that because that gets encapsulated in a zero knowledge proof. And then the network doesn't have to re execute that code. So there is a little bit of that. Evolution in the programming model where you now have two bits of execution logic. You can say what the user is going to do locally, and then what the user is going to do, on the network itself. And so it really opens the design paradigm a little bit more.
Right. From a user perspective, what does it look like to use the chain?
It looks like any other wallet experience out there. So that's the beauty about it is, having, myself certainly having been in crypto for the past decade, I understand, what users expect on that front. And I think most of the team here does too. So we've really tried to focus the kind of design patterns for the user to look and feel as if they were using any other blockchain.
What's your greatest ambition with Alio, and kind of what it could potentially address one day?
Well, I certainly think that the stablecoin payment side of things is going to be a massive, massive unlock for crypto. And I think the analogy to really draw from is if you look at the early web and how HTTP to HTTPS happened. If you go back 20, 25 years ago and you go to any hotel, like Hilton.com, the websites honestly looked a lot like a phone book. You go onto these sites, it gives you a picture of the hotel with the beach resort in front, and then you get like an address and a phone number and says, call me, basically.
Right.
And like you couldn't really go and book or make a reservation because users weren't comfortable putting their credit card numbers onto a website that had no encryption on it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the minute HTTPS came around, the overnight sensation of e-commerce changed. It unlocked so much value because now I could not only just enter my credit card number onto the portal, but I could create an account. I could sign in. I could add my personal details onto it. I can put a lot of information over the web that I previously wasn't comfortable adding, right? And I think that the same is true about crypto, that despite the fact that we've gotten so far in crypto and the numbers look so large already, it's still nothing. It pales in comparison to what, traditional finance looks like at its
Right.
scale, right? And so I think the real opportunity here by bringing privacy to crypto is to actually capture that entire TAM. And that is a much bigger pie than what any of us could even foresee right now. You add in the fact that AI is really taking off, agentic commerce is going to be a big thing. And I think we're actually not just going to embrace the rest of TradFi's scale, but we're actually going to expand it even further. So to those who are thinking that crypto is already really big, I actually think it's really small right now.
How do you address that kind of biz dev problem of, okay, well, we know this industry is going to grow. There's kind of a couple early winners we're seeing. Maybe they'll continue to win, maybe not. But we know that we want this activity to happen on our chain. How do you approach that problem?
Well, it's an education problem, first off. Most people don't even know that private smart contracts are a thing yet because it is so new. Like we are the first ZK layer 1 to support private smart contracts, period. And we are still the only ones in the market today. There are other companies and other teams that are now building the exact same ideas, but they're still 12 to 24 months away from launching. And so, I think there is an education piece to it where we have to tell them, hey, this is possible, and more so tell them what the problems are with the current user flows in crypto. People aren't as educated about the problems, especially when you really get to the technical bits of it. But the minute that they see it, it's like a light bulb goes off and they suddenly recognize, oh shit, like I didn't know that this was a problem. And like now they understand why they want to use this. So a big part has been the education piece. I also think that, the broader piece is that we're still, despite being so far into crypto, we're still quite early relatively in crypto. Like when you look at adoption trends for any major technology, like a decade is kind of like the starting point. and you end up having to take a good 20 to 30 years to reach 80% penetration. So I think we are at a similar mark where we're just starting to see institutionalization of crypto, but institutions haven't used it to the point where, my mother is logging into, her brokerage account and just seeing this as like a general basket or a general bucket that you should be investing in, or that all of her assets are already, converted into crypto rails. Like, this is still very, very early in that regards.
Yeah, or even I think about, the ability to use or to be operating on crypto rails. A brokerage account is a great example.
Yeah.
Where it could all be operating on crypto rails and I don't even notice as an end
Yeah,
user.
right. And so I think that a lot of the crypto adoption we're about to see in the next few years is going to be this quote unquote B2B to C, where, a lot of the back end rails will be swapped out from the kind of traditional legacy tech into crypto rails. But for the end user, because there is a brokerage managing it, they won't have to reason about, wallet addresses or private keys or seed phrases or all this stuff that, really hurts the user entry into crypto.
Every ecosystem, every chain is kind of fighting for this institutional adoption, and it is a real dogfight right now. What do you bring to institutions or companies or devs or builders that has kind of been most resonant with them, where they say, oh, I get this is a light bulb, this is unique for you guys, and now I want to build on Alio?
I honestly think it starts with understanding the problem, and it's showing a level of maturity to that problem. So, for instance, compliance is an area that we've really called out to be an area of focus, because a lot of these institutions care about the compliance risk of using crypto. As you know, there's so many kind of fly-by-night projects in crypto, and there's a lot of scams in crypto. And I think a lot of these institutions are averse to embracing a system that has those, because of the optics that it would give to their customers and their users, right? And so leaning in and saying, look, these are systems now that we're building where there's policy engines, there's rules engines. You have complete control over how you want the system to run. And honestly, like, it making it a little bit more boring, because, a lot of crypto is about hype and it's thematic and it's attention grabbing. And, as great as that is, I don't think those are the things that this audience actually values or prioritizes. So really showing them this is a system that's reliable. It has the compliance narrative and the compliance rails that you need to actually build into, and then integrating it for them and showing them how it works with pilots really gets them to perk their ears up and listen and take you really seriously.
It's almost like bringing a maturity or something to the space, because we've seen this narrative where, the retail user says, oh, the TradFi suits, we can't have the suits come in. We want to, play with our meme coins and do our MEV and stuff. And like, it almost takes a different type of, a different archetype of project or a different type of founder to say like, no, we have to address this market in a different way, in a more mature way, in a way that speaks to them kind of differently. And maybe it can be a separate corner of the market than the public blockchains that we're all gonna, trade our meme coins on or NFTs on or something. But it's going to really open up the pie in a totally different way.
That's right. I think being a decentralized and permissionless ecosystem, look, crypto is going to do what crypto wants to do, even on a system like Alio. But I think because of that, we don't need to focus on that side of crypto. Our goal and our mission is to really bring crypto into the real world from a utility standpoint. And therefore, our focus has been on showing, these institutions how to actually use a system that has the level of privacy they've come to expect from Web 2, alongside the scale and the cost factors that make it more enticing than traditional rails.
You mentioned you've really pushed on this idea of stablecoins and how you guys are addressing it. Are there any other corners of kind of TradFi tokenization, RWA, yield generally that you guys are building for?
First off, all of the above that you just mentioned, and I'd say lending protocols as well. And really, it's really thinking about, look, how do we productize all of these services that people expect of a brokerage or expect of a bank account in crypto? And I think that there's been a lot of talk about that in other ecosystems, but there hasn't been a lot of action. So I think for us, the priority has been ensuring that our infrastructure not only supports that, but supports it on a level that people have gotten used to in Web 2. And I think that is a huge opportunity if it's done correctly.
Right. So when you think about product, or you think about people building on the platform, is it kind of you guys are trying to build things that are compelling for the TradFi world? Are you trying to allow it to be accessible for the TradFi world to build their own products, or is it kind of like a separate dev that you kind of try to integrate in the ecosystem, a crypto native dev who you're trying to help build for this kind of world?
I would lean strongly into the accessibility side of things. So one of the main challenges with building privacy tech is the fact that privacy is hard. Like if you think about how typical blockchains work, you have block explorers that are indexing all of the state and all of the data for the user on their behalf. And because of that, there are APIs you can just call and just fetch that information immediately from. When it comes to privacy, it's not as obvious and it's not as simple. Why? Because when you look at the blockchain, you look at the raw data, everything's encrypted, everything is private. And so, because of that, when you're trying to find your information, it can be like finding a needle in a haystack, right? And so, that's where you need really good tooling, and more so, you need product people to really think intentionally about the SDKs, the APIs, the state itself to make it accessible and make it performant for other people to embrace and adopt. So a lot of the time that we spend right now is on building out that type of dev tooling to make it as easy, as frictionless, as seamless for other partners to integrate into Alio. I think that ultimately this was something that a lot of the first gen privacy coins, failed to recognize or failed to address. And now that you have private smart contracts and even more programmability than ever before, you really need to double down on that thesis. And so that's where we've really taken a stance of saying, let's focus on the product itself. Let's focus on the services themselves and make them as accessible to these, call it traditional players that are coming into the space. I think that when you fast forward a few years from now, we will all have up leveled to the point that these endpoints may look more like full on packaged products. But today, I'd say a lot of it feels like infrastructure that's being provided.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of think about the analogy that I have in my head is kind of like post.com boom, where it was like a lot of things were happening, but it might have not looked like from an external perspective. But what we needed to do was kind of build the foundation for the products, the next generation of products to happen later in 2008, 2009, 2010 and beyond.
Yeah, I think if you look at from analogies, the .com phase, Amazon's a really good example of a company that said, there is the hype machine, but we're going to focus on doubling down on our core stack and our core offerings to customers and focus on what actually matters. And because of that, you saw the advent of AWS, which ended up becoming 50% of their entire business's value, right? And I think that it's very similarly here, that when you think about that privacy is the major unlock for real world adoption, then the infrastructure behind privacy ends up becoming the thing you really need to double down on, because that is the hard bit that makes privacy accessible. And that is the bit that no one is investing time or energy into right now. So I think when you look at it from an analogy standpoint, this is exactly what we're doing.
You mentioned kind of setting a base for a couple years down the line. Looking down the road a couple of years, what's kind of a benchmark or an application or an unlock or a partnership that might happen a couple of years from now, and you would say, okay, we're on the right track, like all of this was worth it, we've set the foundation, and now we're ready for that next kind of hockey stick up?
Well, I think you have to crawl, then walk, then run, right? So I think when you look at it from breaking it down, you need to start with like the basic fundamental bits. Right now, today, there are no private stablecoins in the market. And I think that is already one milestone that as an ecosystem, everyone is kind of fighting for or trying to figure out how to solve for. Certainly, we are on track on that front as well. And once you have that, then I think it's the next pair, which is to say, what are the assets that you would want to have on chain that become private and accessible? And I think RWAs is a very interesting area to look at, because the average consumer is looking for things like assets that are in their brokerage accounts. And I think seeing, private RWAs and assets like that become an offering is also the next step that we would look at. I think beyond that, it starts to look more generally into saying, what are the different types of, institutionalized products that exist in TradFi today that don't exist in crypto because of this kind of gap in privacy and in compliance. And as you see those come up, then it becomes obvious, okay, we are very well on track to seeing the actual kind of traditional system coming onto Web3 rails.
I want to key into one thing you said there. We have this kind of universe of stable coins, a couple of big winners, some kind of more, I guess we call them exotic stable coins coming online more every day. Is there an Alio native stablecoin, and how does that fit into your vision?
I'll say we're absolutely exploring this,
Uh-huh.
and there will be some more news to come on this front.
Phenomenal.
Alpha for the listeners.
Well, that's a tie-in. What should your community and kind of the Alio curious people out there, what should those kind of people be looking forward in the coming days, weeks, months?
So first off, I would say our focus right now is on wallets, stablecoins, and bridges. These have been the key areas for us because these are the tools and the rails that connect us to the rest of crypto.
Mm-hmm.
Without those going well, one of the main challenges, of course, is you end up as an island of your own, disconnected from the rest of reality. And I think that this is also one of the lessons that can be learned when you look at how some of these banks are thinking about crypto. They've been, trying these permissioned or privately closed off blockchains that don't connect to the crypto that most people are familiar with. And I think that is a lesson well learned that you're not really setting yourself up for success. So I think to the community, certainly, it's recognizing that we are focused significantly on bringing wallet rails, stablecoin rails, and bridge rails onto the network. From there, I'd say it's really about then opening the door to TradFi and to DeFi to really come play and explore. That's something that you would expect of any chain, really. But more so here, there's this unique journey for money that did not exist on other chains. And so, what we're really spending time now is working with teams that have unique use cases that were unaddressed. And I think Request Finance was a great example of one that I mentioned. Another one is Revolut. We just announced a partnership with them.
Mm-hmm.
And that ecosystem is one that, when you look at neobanks, they're some of the great enablers for a lot of the finance use cases, whether it be for cross-border payments, point-of-sale terminals, transactions in general. And they have the same privacy problems because from a business intelligence standpoint, their customers care a lot about the information that's available or parsable from block explorers. And so, we're really thinking about it as like this kind of B2B2C approach where you're really thinking about who are the most interesting customers to integrate a system like this, and what are we fundamentally unlocking for their customers.
So it's almost like, a new set of unlocks around product for developers and companies building on top. It enables a whole new, set of use cases.
Exactly. I think that's why I said, earlier, we really reason about this from a complementary tech stack to the rest of crypto. Because when you look at how smart contract platforms have been architected today, everyone has to pay gas on those transactions, and that gas alone reveals or links who you are and your identity.
Yeah.
And so when you start with a chain that's private by default, you actually are providing gas abstraction as well, so that you're not revealing who the payer of that gas was, meaning you can't aggregate that information. And so these are the little things that I think really go a long way when you're very intentional from the get-go that your tech stack supports privacy
Right.
as a use case.
Yeah, and really that it must be from a base level that privacy is built out, because
Yeah.
other projects haven't made these considerations in their stack.
Exactly. And look, like, I don't blame them. Like, when you go back 10 years ago to when these were being conceived of, this wasn't that big of an issue because people assumed that things like Bitcoin were private. And so, because of that, there was kind of a lack of market knowledge or understanding about where things were at. And certainly we've had the benefit of the last 10 years of experience to learn from, to be able to actually come up with a system that, meets reality to where it's at now.
Well, if you think about something like Zcash, like the idea, they were looking at Bitcoin and they were like, well, let's make kind of like privacy Bitcoin, right?
Yeah.
And they didn't imagine a world where, people would be talking to big banks about, stable coins,
Right.
and, tokenizing assets on chain. So they didn't build for that. And it takes a new generation to kind of build for that.
Yeah, I'd say that for existing blockchains, as much as they are trying to make that pivot and make that switch into this, their architectures are inherently at odds with it. So while they can attempt to do that, they'll never be able to reach the satisfactory level that's needed for these use cases. And even if they are able to do it, it will require significant changes to the core design itself, or embracing an entirely new architecture to get there. So I think that's where we have a really interesting opportunity to show and not just tell. I think everyone's talking about the opportunities that TradFi coming to crypto will bring, but very few are able to actually show how that's going to work on a scalable and practical and privacy preserving manner.
What's the one metric that's most important to you as a founder?
Well, certainly as a founder, there's there's a number of metrics that I care about, but I'd say at its very core, I'd say it really comes down to understanding like how many people am I solving problems for right now,
Hmm.
and the adoption on that front has been going really well because of the pickup that we've gotten from the validation of these conversations. Like, there's a lot of teams that are now trying pilots on Alio. They're trying to build out payment use cases, and more so, they're doing it in these privacy preserving ways, like. That's something that I keep a really close eye on because I want to see, are we actually bringing more utility to the crypto ecosystem or not? And I think that for a lot of existing chains, they look at it from a pure kind of marketing or vanity metric standpoint. But certainly, like myself, like I was in grad school before I started Alio, and I had the opportunity to go down the academia route. And a lot of the pick that I made was to say, well, I want to make an impact with the tech that I'm working on. And I could do that in academia, but it likely wouldn't get the same level of impact as going into industry. So for me, the utility factor really matters a lot.
What does Alio winning look like?
I think if we fast forward to, let's say in 5 to 10 years from now, if we can service 90+% of all of the privacy preserving payments that are happening in the crypto ecosystem, I would say that we're very well on our path to a successful future there.
Hmm.
And I think that a lot of what we're doing right now is setting ourselves up for that narrative to happen.
Right. So do you think that you guys could be the 100% privacy chain? Like, is it possible to win the privacy space, or will it always be fragmented?
I think that there will always be other players because crypto inherently is decentralized. So there will inherently be new projects building new solutions that address needs that we just simply can't take on.
Hmm.
Whether it be because there's too many changes that need to happen or because there's all sorts of new use cases that are unlocked by new stacks. So I think what we're doing is a very strong attempt at capturing 80% of those use cases. And
Right.
then the remaining 20% will be solved by all sorts of different builders with their unique architectures and designs.
Kind of like a long tail
Yeah, exactly.
solution. Cool. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Howard, thanks so much for being here. Alio, really appreciate your time. And yeah, have a good time at the rest of the conference.
Jack, thank you for having me. This was a phenomenal opportunity.
Thanks.